Chapter 24, the Urinary System, Part 1. So, the urinary system is deceptively simple. If you look at the main organs, we have the right and left kidneys. We have the ureters, right and left ureters attaching the kidneys to the urinary bladder. And then from the urinary bladder, we have the urethra, which carries the urine outside of the body. Seems pretty simple. The kidneys, right and left, their functions include regulation of blood composition and blood volume. So that means that the kidneys are very important when it comes to maintaining overall health because they maintain the composition of the blood. The kidneys also help regulate blood pressure and the pH of blood. And finally, the kidneys also help to excrete cellular wastes by taking wastes out of the bloodstream and depositing it in the urine. The ureters, urinary bladder and urethra, their functions is urine storage, urine transport, and urine discharge. The kidneys are in the abdominal cavity. They're attached to the posterior wall of the abdominal cavity. They lie approximately between the last thoracic lumbar and the last thoracic vertebrae and the third lumbar vertebrae. So they are slightly protected by ribs 11 and 12. And the right kidney, it turns out, is lower than the left kidney. Again, as I said, they're attached to the posterior wall of the abdominal cavity. They're attached by adipose tissue, that's fatty tissue, and additional connective tissue, providing a little cushion for the kidneys. And the space where structures like blood vessels and the ureter and nerves and so on go in and out of the kidney, that space is referred to as the renal hilum. So when we look at the kidney, we see that it is quite an interesting structure. There is a very dark structure on the outside of the kidney called the renal capsule. Below that, we have this light tissue. This light tissue going all the way around is the renal cortex. The renal cortex includes where the light tissue passes deeper into the kidney. These areas where the lighter tissues passing deeper in are known as renal columns. So renal column, renal column, renal column, renal column, all part of the renal cortex. Then we have the renal medulla. The renal medulla are all of these patches of darker colored tissue. An individual patch of darker colored tissue is called a renal pyramid. So we have lots and lots of renal pyramids. Each renal pyramid ends in a renal papilla, and the renal papillas fit into minor calyxes. So renal pyramid with a renal papilla, all of the renal pyramids together make up the renal medulla. As I mentioned, the renal pyramids fit into the minor calyxes. These are little tube-like structures that carry urine. The minor calyxes then fuse to form major calyxes, a few major calyxes. And the major calyxes then fuse to form the renal pelvis. And then the renal pelvis, as it passes the renal hilum, becomes the ureter. So the renal pelvis is continuous with the ureter. And the minor calyxes, major calyxes, and the renal pelvis are all found in an area referred to as the renal sinus. Here's just a cross-section of an actual kidney with the renal cortex, the renal columns. Here's a renal column, there's a renal column, there's a renal column. The renal pyramids, making up the renal medulla, minor calyx, major calyxes, renal pelvis, ureter. Nephrotosis, or floating kidney, is when one of the kidneys becomes displaced from the posterior abdominal wall and migrates lower inferiorly. So here's normal placement of kidneys. Here's where one of these kidneys is suffering from nephrotosis. This is dangerous because the ureter can become kinked and blocked, preventing the flow of urine to the urinary bladder. All right, so we see here where they have in blue the veins, red is arteries, and then yellows the calyxes. So lots and lots and lots of blood vessels within the kidney. Of course, because the kidneys are involved in maintaining the proper composition of blood. So there's a lot of blood flowing into and out of the kidneys, entering the renal via the renal artery, exiting via the renal vein. The nephron, here is a cartoon version of the nephron. Here's a nephron from our model. Nephrons are microscopic structures in the kidney, and they are considered the functional unit of the kidney. The processes that occur in the nephrons are what produce urine. The first process is called filtration. It occurs in the renal corpuscle. Go back here, the little ball-like structure is the renal corpuscle. And the renal corpuscle has within it a structure called a glomerulus. The glomerulus is a capillary bed with blood arriving by the afferent arteriole, goes into the glomerulus, and then exits the efferent arteriole. Within the glomerulus, fluids from the bloodstream exit and enter the capsular space. This fluid has basically everything that is found in the blood plasma that is smaller than proteins. So proteins and cells stay in the bloodstream. Things smaller than that will leave, are being filtered out into the capsular space. From here, the filtrate will then enter the beginning of the nephron. In the beginning of the nephron, we get tubular resorption. Tubular resorption is the movement of materials from the renal tubule to the bloodstream. So we're returning nutrients, we're returning water and ions. Things that are supposed to stay in the blood are returned to the blood. And most of what's left behind are wastes and other things in excess. And then the third process that occurs later on in the renal tubule is called tubular secretion. Tubular secretion is when some materials within the bloodstream return to the nephron, move from the bloodstream back into the nephron. And this purpose of tubular secretion is to help fine-tune the composition of the blood so it is at the ideal pH and ion levels. And then the fluid that leaves the nephron is officially urine. So the renal corpuscle, that ball-like structure, as we already know, has these capillary bed called the glomerulus, receives blood from the afferent arteriole, and so we have blood arriving by the afferent arteriole, enters the glomerulus, and then exits by the efferent arteriole. The blood pressure in the glomerulus is the highest you will find for blood capillaries. Not the highest blood pressure, the highest for blood capillaries, and this is to aid in the filtration process. We also, of course, have the tube-like structure, the ball-like structure surrounding the glomerulus. This is called the glomerular capsule. Glomerular capsule has an outer layer and an inner layer, the inner layer lying on the surface of the glomerulus, and then, of course, a space between those two layers, the glomerular capsule space, where the filtrate will form. So this glomerular capsule is a two-layered, two-walled structure with a parietal layer on the outside and a visceral layer lying on the glomerulus. Taking a close-up look of the glomerulus with the visceral layer of the glomerular capsule, you see that it has these very interesting-looking cells. These interesting-looking cells are called the podocytes. And the podocytes are the cells making up the visceral layer of the glomerular capsule. They are lying on the glomerulus, and as you can see, they interlock with each other, leaving only tiny slits, these filtration slits, where materials are allowed to pass through the glomerulus and the visceral layer of the glomerular capsule. And this is the filtration membrane. So the filtration membrane is made up of the wall of the glomerulus and the podocytes making up the visceral layer of the glomerular capsule. And it is this filtration membrane that prevents large things like proteins from leaving. Only things smaller than proteins can exit the bloodstream and enter the capsular space. All right, from here we get to the renal tubule. The renal tubule is a long, microscopic but long tube-like structure stretching from the renal corpuscle, passing through both the cortex and the medulla of the kidney, and eventually emptying into this separate tube-like structure. The very beginning of the renal tubule is the proximal convoluted tubule. Proximal because it comes directly after the renal corpuscle, convoluted because it's all twisted up, and tubule because, well, it is tube-like. The primary function that occurs in the proximal convoluted tubule is reabsorption, tubular resorption, the return of materials, water, ions, etc. to the bloodstream. From here we have the nephron loop dipping down into the renal medulla. Nephron loop has a descending limb and an ascending limb. Descending because filtrate's moving down deeper into the kidney. Ascending limb as it rises back up toward the cortex. And resorption, tubular resorption also occurs here. And then the last part of the renal tubule is the distal convoluted tubule. Distal because it's further away from the renal corpuscle as the filtrate flows. Convoluted because it's twisted up. Tubule because it is tube-like. Within the distal convoluted tubule is we get most of the tubular secretion. So this is where some materials will return into the nephron from the bloodstream. So some substances, ions primarily, will move back into the nephron at the distal convoluted tubule. And then the filtrate will exit that and enter this long-like tube called the collecting duct. When the filtrate enters the collecting duct, it is now officially urine. The collecting duct is not part of the nephron. It is a separate structure. It is receiving urine from thousands of nephrons, and it will transport that urine down deeper into the kidney, down to the renal papilla, where eventually the urine gets emptied into the minor calyx. The collecting duct does allow for some tubular secretion, so some substances from the bloodstream will enter the collecting duct. And also, of course, water. Water can also be secreted and resorbed depending on hormones that are released. Juxtaglomerular apparatus is a part of the nephron. The juxtaglomerular apparatus is composed of the ascending limb of the nephron loop, just a tiny piece of it, and the afferent arteriole. So part of the wall of the afferent arteriole and part of the wall of the ascending limb make up what's known as the juxtaglomerular apparatus. This structure is very important because it helps to control the blood pressure within the glomerulus. If the blood pressure in the glomerulus gets too high, then that could damage the glomerulus, leading to kidney problems. If the pressure in the glomerulus is too low, then not enough filtrate will be produced, and the blood will not be properly regulated, and its composition will go out of sync. So here is the glomerular capsule. Here is the glomerulus, afferent arteriole, filtrate passes through the glomerulus into the capsular space. Will then travel via the proximal convoluted tubule, down through the nephron loop, up to the distal convoluted tubule, and then empty into the collecting duct. So here is a collecting duct that then leads to the renal papilla and empties into the minor calyx. And this is where we will stop for this part of the lecture.